The rain had been falling on Winslow Hall for 3 days without pause, and by the third night the old house had begun to smell of it, of damp plaster and wet stone, of coal smoke that could not quite dry the air it moved through. The estate sat low in a fold of the Somerset Hills, its east wing shuttered since the old baronet's wife had died, its gardens gone to bramble everywhere except one small square of ground behind the kitchen wall, where, against all reason, a single rose bush still fought to bloom. The house had once been grand. Now its grandness survived only in the things too heavy to sell. The long oak table in the hall, scarred by decades of elbows and correspondence and grief, and the family portraits, dark, with soot, watching over rooms that had grown too cold for the fires allotted to them. Ivy had begun to take the north wall in earnest, working its slow green fingers between stones that had once been pointed and proud, and the weather vane above the stable had rusted into a single fixed direction years ago, and never been coaxed to turn again. It was the kind of house that had stopped expecting good news, and had, in its long silence, taught the people inside it to do the same. Miss Clara Winslow rose before the rest of the household did, as she always did, because someone had to see that the fires were laid and the milk brought in before the frost took it, and because it had been 4 years since anyone else in the house had thought to ask whether these things needed doing at all. She dressed in the grey wool she had turned twice, mended the elbow of her father's coat by candlelight before breakfast, and counted the household's remaining candles as she counted everything now, carefully, and without complaint, because complaining changed nothing, and candles were dear. She kept a small ledger in a drawer no one else opened, columns of figures in her own careful hand, and she had learned to read in those columns the whole slow story of a family's decline the way another woman might read a novel. The sale of the good silver 2 winters past, the letting go of the second footman, the quiet arrangement with the butcher that allowed credit until Michaelmas. She was 23, neither beauty nor burden by any account that mattered to her family, and she had long since stopped waiting for anyone to notice the difference between a house that ran and a house that merely stood. She was, in the particular arithmetic of her family, the elder daughter, which was another way of saying the daughter who was expected to be useful rather than admired. Her younger sister Diana had been born lovely, in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her, gold-haired and quick-tongued, with a laugh that carried and eyes that seemed always to be measuring the effect of themselves upon whoever looked into them. Their father, Sir Edmund Windsor, had spent the family's dwindling fortune quietly and cheerfully upon her, come out, her gowns, her music master, as though loveliness alone might yet solve what debt had made a very plain arithmetic indeed. Clara did not resent this. Precisely, she had simply learned, in the slow, accumulating way that children learn the shape of a house by walking into its door frames in the dark, exactly how much space she was permitted to take up. And she had shrunk herself accordingly, until shrinking no longer felt like a choice at all, only a habit worn as smooth and unremarkable as an old shoe. That particular morning, she was in the still room, straining a decoction of feverfew for old Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper's joints, when Diana swept in still in her night-clothes, trailing a shawl she had not bothered to fasten, and announced that the blue silk would not do for Thursday, that it made her look sallow, and that Clara must let out the seams of the rose-coloured one instead, tonight, by candlelight if need be, because Lord Alderman's mother was said to notice such things, and Diana did not intend to be noticed unfavourably by anyone ever again. "It will want 3 hours at least," Clara said, not looking up from the strainer. "Then you had better begin at once," said Diana, already turning away, already forgetting the sentence had been spoken at all, since you have nothing else to occupy you?" Clara did not answer. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing, and complaint changed rather less, and so she said only that she would see to it, and went on straining the feverfew until the liquid ran clear, and thought, as she often thought, that it was a curious thing to be so entirely necessary to a household, and so entirely invisible within it at the very same time, as though a person might be load-bearing and unseen in the way a foundation stone is load-bearing and unseen, felt only when it finally gives way. It would want mentioning, for anyone unfamiliar with the Winslow household, that a duke had lately begun making inquiries after it, not directly, not yet, but through the careful, oblique channels by which such things were arranged among people who had learned to distrust directness. His Grace the Duke of Marlstone had inherited, 3 years past, a title he had never wanted, and an estate he had inherited alongside a great deal of debt his late father had left carefully hidden behind good tailoring and better manners. And in the years since he had discovered exactly what every unmarried duke eventually discovers, that a title turns a man into a sum of money walking on 2 legs, hunted by every family with a daughter and a debt of its own, admired for a face he had not chosen, and a fortune he had not yet secured, and never once, in 3 years of ballrooms, asked a single question about the man underneath the coronet. He had watched 2 friends marry women who had performed devotion beautifully at their weddings and coldness efficiently ever after, once the ring was secured and the performance no longer necessary. And he had watched, too, his own mother spend the whole of her marriage smiling at dinners while writing letters, alone in her rooms afterward, that spoke of a loneliness no title had ever cured. He had concluded, with the particular bitterness of a clever man who mistakes one sad pattern for the whole of the truth, that no woman living could want him, and not merely the coronet that came attached to him, and he had built around that conviction a wall as careful and load-bearing, in its own way, as any Clara Winslow had ever built around her own disappointments. It was his aunt, Lady Pembridge, who had first mentioned the Winslow girl, the younger one, the beauty, said to be sweet-tempered and biddable, and in want of precisely the sort of fortune Marlstone could still, despite the debts, provide. She had arranged, in the manner of aunts who consider matchmaking a form of Christian duty, a proper introduction for the coming month. A ball at which the thing might be settled in the customary fashion, over lemonade and careful conversation, and the studied indifference both parties would be expected to perform for an audience that expected nothing more honest of either of them. The Duke had agreed to attend. And then, restless and suspicious in the particular way of a man who has been lied to once too often, he had done something considerably less customary. He had written to no one, told no one, not even Lady Pembridge, who would have been horrified, and had ridden alone to the village nearest Winslow Hall under a name that was not his own, to see, before any ring was offered, before any performance could be rehearsed, what manner of house he was truly being invited into, and what manner of daughter truly lived there when no one was watching for a duke at all. He told himself it was prudence. He suspected, somewhere beneath the telling, that it was also a kind of hope he was ashamed to name, that somewhere in this unremarkable Somerset house he might find something that had not yet learned to perform for him. He had inherited the title on a wet, November morning, 3 years past, summoned from his rooms at Oxford by a black-edged letter that informed him, in his father's solicitor's careful hand, that the 7th Duke of Marlstone was dead of an apoplexy at the card table, and that his son was now the 8th. He had come home to find the estate mortgaged in 3 places he had never been told of, Tenant farms let fall into disrepair, while his father dined in London on credit no one dared refuse a duke, and a mother grown so accustomed to smiling through her own quiet unhappiness that she had, by the time he arrived, very nearly forgotten how to do anything else. He had spent the 3 years since untangling what his father's charm had so carelessly knotted, and had learned, in the process, to distrust charm itself as a kind of currency, the coin spent by people who wanted something and had not yet decided to ask for it honestly. It was this, more than any single betrayal, that had hardened into the conviction he carried now, riding toward a stable yard under a name that was not his own, that a title made a man desirable in exactly the way a full purse makes a stranger friendly, and that he would rather learn the truth of a house by candlelight and horse dung than by ballroom compliments that cost their speaker nothing at all. He arrived at the stable yard of Winslow Hall on a grey afternoon, dressed plainly, his horse deliberately unremarkable, and gave his name to the head groom as Gideon Hart, a travelling man seeking work with horses, having heard the estate was short-handed. It was not, strictly, a lie. He had been christened Gideon. The rest of his name he had simply set down at the gate, the way a man sets down a heavy coat before entering a low doorway he suspects will not otherwise admit him. The head groom, an old man named Fenn with more work than hands to do it, looked him over once, noted the quality of his boots with a flicker of suspicion that Gideon met with a shrug and a claim of a former employer's charity, and set him to mucking stalls before the sun went down. Gideon Hart, Duke of Marlstone, spent his first night at Winslow Hall sleeping above the stable on a pallet that smelled of hay and horse, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that he slept better there than he had in his own vast, echoing bed in a month, as though some part of him had been waiting a long while for a room too small to hold any pretense. It was 3 days before he saw her properly. He had noticed the pale, quiet woman in grey moving about the kitchen garden at dawn. Noticed her the way one notices weather, without particular interest. But it was on the 3rd morning, when the stable boy Tam took a fall from the hayloft and came up wailing with a wrist bent wrong, that Gideon first saw her do anything worth remembering. She came out from the kitchen at the boy's cry, before anyone had thought to fetch her, knelt in the mud without regard for her hem, and set the wrist herself, with a quick, sure competence that spoke of practice rather than instinct, murmuring the whole while in a low voice that had nothing performed in it at all, steady, unhurried, the voice of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again, and took no particular pride in either fact. "You've done this before," Gideon said, before he had decided to speak at all. She glanced up at him, the new groom, a stranger, nothing to her, and said only, "My father does not keep a physician on retainer any longer. Someone must learn." Then she returned to the boy, and told him in the same unhurried voice that he had been very brave, and had also been extremely foolish, and that both things could be true of a person at once, and Tam laughed through his tears, and Gideon Hart stood in the mud with a bucket in his hand, and felt something in his chest do a small, unfamiliar thing that he did not, yet, have a name for. He watched her for a fortnight after that, in the way a man watches something he has decided is not his business to watch. He watched her mend Fenn's coat, without being asked, watched her save back the good bread for the kitchen girl, who was too shy to ask for seconds, watched her walk the walled garden behind the kitchen each evening at dusk, and kneel by the one surviving rosebush there, working dead wood from it with careful hands, murmuring to it the way some people murmur to horses or to God. He learned, from the servants' idle talk over supper, that the garden had been her mother's, before the fever took her, and that Miss Clara had kept it alive alone for 4 years now, though nothing else in the house had thought it worth the saving. He learned other things too, in that fortnight, things he had not gone looking for and could not now unknow. He learned that the family's true daughter, the one his aunt had arranged him to court, was the golden-haired younger sister Diana, who swept through the house like weather, and spoke to the servants the way one speaks to furniture that has become inconveniently animate. He heard her, one wet afternoon, tell Clara across the length of the dining room that the letter Clara had spent an hour composing on the family's behalf to a creditor was clumsily worded and an embarrassment, and that Clara ought to be grateful someone with sense would rewrite it before it went out at all, though Gideon, passing the window with an armful of wood, could see through the gap in the curtain that the letter Diana handed back an hour later was Clara's original, unchanged but for the signature. He held his tongue. It was not his place, as Gideon Hart, the groom, to have an opinion about the daughters of the house. But he began, without entirely admitting it to himself, to arrange his work so that it brought him near the kitchen garden at dusk, when the light went gold and soft, and Clara Winslow knelt over her mother's roses and spoke to them as though they might yet answer. One evening he brought her water without being asked, having noticed she had none, and she thanked him with a startled, unguarded warmth that told him plainly no one had thought to bring her anything in a very long while. He almost told her then that her hands were shaking with cold and she ought to go in. He said nothing. He only set the pail down and went back to the stable, and lay awake that night, turning the shape of her over in his mind, the way one turns over a coin found unexpectedly in an old coat pocket. Uncertain yet what it was worth, there were small, ordinary days in that fortnight that he would remember afterward with a clarity out of all proportion to how little had happened in them. There was the afternoon she taught Tam his letters at the kitchen table, while the bread proved, tracing shapes and spilled flour with one patient finger, and looked up to find Gideon in the doorway, and did not send him away, only asked, mildly, whether he could read, and seemed neither surprised nor unimpressed when he said that he could. There was the morning he found her repairing a hinge on the garden gate herself, having asked no one, because asking had so rarely produced results that she had simply stopped doing it, and he took the tools from her hands without a word, and finished the work himself, while she stood by, arms folded, watching him with an expression he could not read, and did not then try very hard to. "You needn't have," she said, when it was done. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." It was such a small sentence. She looked at him a long moment, as though it were the first time in years anyone had wanted anything on her behalf rather than from her, and said nothing at all, and went in. There was a Sunday in that same fortnight when the whole household walked to church together, as custom required, and Gideon, seated among the servants at the back of the small stone building, watched Clara sing the hymns in a voice too soft to carry beyond the second pew, and watched Diana, seated grandly beside their father at the front, mouth the words without troubling to produce any sound at all, and thought it a strange, small mirror of the two women's whole characters, one performing devotion for an audience, the other offering it quietly, and for no one's benefit but her own. Afterward, in the churchyard, he watched Clara stop at a modest headstone half swallowed by ivy, and understood, before Fenn later confirmed it, that it must be her mother's grave, and that she visited it alone every week, without any of the rest of her family troubling to accompany her. She was a fine woman, the old mistress, Fenn said that evening, apropos of nothing, working his oil into the leather with the unhurried patience of a man who has decided a thing once saying. Kept that garden herself, same as Miss Clara does now, Died of a fever the winter Miss Clara turned 19, and I'll tell you plain, Mr. Hart, this house was never the same house after. Miss Clara took up everything her mother used to carry, quiet as you like, and nobody thanked her for it then, and nobody's thanked her for it since. It isn't right. A good woman going unthanked so long she forgets to expect it. But there it is. Some houses are like that. They use up their kindest people and call it nothing at all. Gideon said only that it seemed a hard thing for a young woman to bear alone, and Fen, misreading nothing at all in the careful flatness of his voice, agreed that it was, and returned to his bridal, and neither of them spoke of it again. But Gideon carried the old groom's words with him a long while afterward, turning them over the way he had turned over the shape of Clara herself, and found that they settled, uncomfortably, alongside every other small proof he had gathered of a household that had mistaken one daughter's endurance for the absence of any feeling worth troubling over. It was Fen who told him, a week later, that the family was expecting a duke. His Grace of Marlstone, the old groom said, working oil into a bridal with the particular relish of a man who enjoys gossip about his betters. Come to look over Miss Diana, they say, with marriage in the offing, if all goes well. Lady Pembridge's doing. She's his aunt, and thick as thieves with Sir Edmund. There's to be a ball got up special, end of the month, to make the introductions proper. Gideon kept his eyes on the harness in his own hands, and said nothing at all, and felt, for the first time since he had ridden onto this estate under a false name, something considerably more complicated than curiosity. A cold, sinking recognition that the deception he had begun as Prudence had, somewhere in the last fortnight, become something he was no longer certain he knew how to end honestly. He began, in the weeks that followed, to notice the small architecture of cruelty that shaped Clara Winslow's days. Not dramatic, not the sort of cruelty that announced itself, but the patient, wearing kind that leaves no bruise a magistrate could see. He watched Diana borrow, take, really the pin money Clara had saved from selling her own embroidery to the village women, with a laugh and a promise to repay that both sisters understood would never be honoured. He watched Sir Edmund praise Diana's accomplishments at supper, while Clara's name went unmentioned, though it had been Clara who balanced the household books that kept them fed at all. He watched, once from the stable door, as Diana discovered Clara asleep at the mending in the small hours, and woke her not with concern, but with irritation that the candle had been burned so low, as though the wax mattered more than the woman. And he watched Clara, every time, absorb it without complaint, set her shoulders, and go on. He began to understand that this was not patience, exactly. It was armour worn so long it had become skin, and he found himself, in the privacy of his own thoughts, furious on her behalf, in a way he had not been furious about anything in a very long time. Not since his own father's debts had first come to light, and he had understood, all at once, how much of what he had believed about his family had been a comfortable lie. He almost said something to her, once in the garden, when she admitted, lightly, as though it were nothing, that she had given up expecting anyone to notice what she did, that she had decided long ago it was easier to do the work and want nothing from it than to do the work and be disappointed. He almost told her that this was not the same as peace, whatever she called it. He opened his mouth to say so, and then closed it again, because he was a groom named Gideon Hart, and a groom had no business telling a lady what her own heart had settled for. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The weeks passed, and the rose bush in the walled garden began, under Clara's patient hands, to put out new growth it had not managed in years. small, stubborn buds along wood that had looked half dead in spring. Gideon took to mending the garden's broken trellis in the evenings, telling her only that he had nothing else to do with his hands after the horses were settled. And she accepted his help the way she accepted most things now, gratefully, and without quite believing it would continue. They fell, in those evenings, into a kind of easy talk neither of them had expected, of books she had read in her father's library before half of it was sold, of places he described, carefully, as belonging to a former employer rather than to himself, of small things that made her laugh, low and surprised, as though laughter itself were a muscle she had not exercised in some while. He found he could make her laugh rather easily, once he set his mind to it, and he set his mind to it often. It was during one of these evenings that he first heard Diana's cruelty escalate beyond the private, and into something with teeth. He had come round the kitchen wall to find Diana in the garden doorway, arms crossed, informing Clara in a voice pitched to carry that she had told Mrs. Aldermont's companion at cards the day before that Clara had once been disappointed of an engagement so badly that she had sworn off marriage altogether, so that no one wonders too hard why you're 23 and unwed, sister, and thinks there's something wrong with the family, instead of simply with you. It was not true. There had been no engagement, disappointed or otherwise. Clara said only, quietly, that she wished Diana would not invent stories about her to strangers, and Diana laughed and said it was hardly an invention, only a kindness, since the truth, that no one had ever wanted her at all, was so very much worse. Gideon, standing in the shadow of the wall with an armful of stakes for the trellis, felt something cold and furious move through him that had nothing to do with grooming horses and everything to do with the particular tone of voice a sister uses when she has learned that cruelty dressed as concern draws no blood anyone can point to. He did not go to Clara that night. He waited until she had gone in, and then he knelt by the rose bush a long while in the dark, and understood, with the plain clarity of a man who has just discovered which way is up, that he had come to this house to observe a family for a marriage that was not his own heart's business, and had instead fallen quietly and entirely for the daughter no one in that family had thought worth arranging. He almost told her the following week, when she found him waiting by the garden gate with the trellis mended, and asked, with a shy warmth she seemed embarrassed by, even as she offered it, whether he had a family of his own, somewhere waiting for him. He almost said, then, I am not who you think I am, and I have begun to want things I have no right to want. He said instead that he had no one waiting, which was, in its own way, true enough to satisfy his conscience, and watched her face do something soft and considering before she wished him good night. There was, too, an afternoon of small consequence that he would remember longer than he expected to. Diana had ordered new gloves from the village, and found them, upon delivery, cut wrong at the wrist, and had flown into a temper loud enough that the whole household heard it, ending by flinging the offending gloves into the fire in the front hall out of pure spite toward the glove-maker. It was Clara who fished them, singed but salvageable, from the grate before they were lost entirely, and mended the seam herself that evening by the same candle she used for her father's coats, without a word of complaint, without expectation of thanks, simply because waste distressed her more than unkindness did by now. Gideon, passing the window with a fresh armful of wood, watched her working the needle in the firelight, and thought that he had never, in 3 years of London ballrooms, seen a single woman do a kindness so entirely unwitnessed and unrewarded, and understood that this, more than any beauty, was the thing he had been searching for without knowing its name. The gossip Diana had planted did its slow work. By the following fortnight, Clara found herself the subject of pitying looks from the vicar's wife, and pointed questions from Mrs. Aldermont about whether she meant to accompany her sister to any of the coming season's entertainments. Questions that carried, underneath their politeness, the clear implication that a disappointed woman of 23 ought to know her place was the margins of such events, not their centre. Clara bore it as she bore everything, with a straight back and a quiet word of correction, where she could manage one. But Gideon, watching from whatever distance his disguise allowed him, saw the cost of it in the new stiffness of her shoulders, the way she had begun, in the last week, to avoid mirrors altogether, and the way her hands, always so steady, had begun to shake very slightly when she thought no one was watching. Clara herself said little of it, though Gideon noticed she had begun, that same week, to decline the small village invitations she might once have accepted. A tea here, a call there, offering the household's mending or the kitchen's demands as reason, when the truer reason was plainly the pitying looks she had grown too tired to keep meeting with composure. He wanted, badly, to tell her that the pity was misplaced, that the whole story Diana had invented was a lie built to flatter no one but its teller. But he understood that, coming from a groom, such reassurance would carry no more weight than wind against a shuttered window, and so he held his tongue and let his anger settle instead into a colder, more useful shape, waiting for the one evening when his words might finally be believed. It was on one of these evenings, mending harness in the tack room, with the door open to the last of the light, that he heard her weeping. Not loudly, not in any way meant to be heard, but through the thin wall that separated the tack room from the little garden shed where she had gone. She thought, entirely alone. He heard her say, to no one, in a voice thick with the effort of not doing exactly what she was doing, that she had learned long ago that tears changed nothing, that they only wasted good candlelight, and left a person's eyes too swollen to see her mending by morning, and that she would not. She would not. But the sentence broke apart before she could finish refusing herself the very thing she was already, helplessly, doing. Gideon stood on the other side of that wall, with his hand flat against the old wood, and did not go to her, because he understood, with an ache he had not expected disguise to cost him, that going to her now, as Gideon Hart the groom, would only give her one more thing to be ashamed of come morning. He waited until her breathing had steadied, and her footsteps had gone, and then he went out into the dark himself, and stood a long while by the rosebush, furious at a family that had taught a good woman to apologize for her own grief, and made himself a quiet, private promise that he did not yet know how he would keep. The ball was a fortnight off now, and the house had begun to hum with the particular anxious energy of a family staking everything on a single evening. Diana's gowns arrived from the dressmaker in a flurry of silk, and Pindham's Sir Edmund fretted openly over whether the wine-cellar could stand one more evening's demands upon it, and Clara, as ever, was set to the invisible labour beneath the visible spectacle, overseeing the kitchens, mending what needed mending, smoothing what needed smoothing. Expected to appear at the edges of the evening in a gown 2 seasons out of fashion, and to want nothing more from it than the honour of having helped it succeed. It was 3 days before the ball that Gideon overheard the conversation that would matter more than any other in this story, overheard it entirely by accident, crouched in the shadow of the stable wall mending a strap, while Diana spoke low and urgent to a visiting cousin she had mistaken for private company. "I have told Papa nothing of the Aldermont debt," Diana was saying, her voice pitched with the particular strain of someone confessing something she found thrilling rather than shameful, "and if the Duke's man asks after our finances before the settlements are drawn, you are to say we owe nothing beyond the ordinary." I have borrowed against my own pin money 3 times over from the tradesmen in the village, on the promise of a duchess's custom once I am married, and if it comes out before the contracts are signed, there will be no marriage at all, and Papa will have my hide for it. And if Clara lets it slip? The cousin asked. She keeps the household books. She'll know, Clara, said Diana, with a small, careless laugh that Gideon would remember for a long time after. Knows to keep her mouth shut about family matters. She always has. It is, I believe, the one useful thing about her. Gideon set down the strap in his hands very carefully, and did not move again until both women had gone back into the house, and thought, with the particular cold clarity that comes to a man who has just been handed exactly the weapon he did not know he needed, that Diana Winslow had just told him everything he required to unmake her, should the evening of the ball demand it. He almost went to Clara that same night to tell her all of it, his name, his title, what he had overheard, what he now understood about the family that had shaped her into someone who apologized for her own tears. He walked as far as the garden gate before he stopped himself, because he understood, with a discipline that cost him more than any ride he had ever taken, that if he told her now, in the dark, without witnesses, it would look, to her, to anyone, like a groom's fevered fantasy, or worse, like exactly the kind of secret-keeping her own family had made into a habit. If he was to undo the harm this house had done her, he would have to do it where the whole of society could see it done, in the same room where the harm had first been dealt. So he waited. And in the waiting, he allowed himself, at last, the one thing he had denied himself the whole fortnight past. He found her in the garden the evening before the ball, kneeling by the rosebush that had, against every expectation, put out its first full bloom of the season, dark red and improbably alive against the grey stone of the wall, and he knelt beside her, and this time, when his hand moved toward hers where it rested on the earth, he did not stop it, and did not pretend afterward that it had been an accident. You did that, he said, meaning the rose, and meaning, though neither of them said it aloud, considerably more than the rose. It wanted very little, she said, only someone willing to keep coming back to it. He almost told her everything then, with her hand still warm under his in the dying light. He said instead, someone ought to keep coming back to you, and watched her go very still and very red, and say nothing at all, because no one, in a very long time, had said anything like that to her, and meant it. She looked up at him then, and for one long moment he thought she might ask him outright who he truly was, as though some part of her already suspected the shape of the answer, and was only waiting for courage enough to hear it spoken. But she only asked, softly, whether he meant to attend tomorrow's ball among the other servants engaged to help, and he said that he rather thought he would be there in some capacity, which was, God help him, the truest thing he had said to her in a month. The night of the ball, Winslow Hall blazed with more candlelight than it had seen in years, borrowed silver on the tables, and borrowed confidence in every corner of it, and Clara Winslow stood at the edge of the ballroom, in her 2 seasons old gown, doing the work she always did, directing footmen, soothing the temperamental musicians, making certain the punch did not run dry, while her sister, resplendent in new silk, waited at the top of the receiving line for the arrival of a duke neither of them yet knew she had already, in every way that mattered, fallen in love with. He arrived precisely on the hour, in his own carriage, in his own clothes, announced by his own full and correct name, and the room went the particular kind of silent that only a title can produce. Clara, near the punch table, looked up along with everyone else to see the newcomer, and felt the floor tilt very slightly beneath her. because the man being announced as His Grace the Duke of Marlstone was wearing a face she knew as well as her own hands, the face of a groom named Gideon Hart, who had mended her trellis and brought her water, and told her, one evening past, that someone ought to keep coming back to her. He found her eyes across the room at once, as though he had been looking for nothing else since he walked in, and something passed between them that the rest of the assembled company mistook, for one confused moment, for simple recognition of a duke by a household he had come to visit. Only Clara understood what it truly was, and she stood very still with a cup of punch forgotten in her hand, and did not know, for the length of several long breaths, whether to be furious or undone. She set the cup down very carefully, as though it were the only steady thing left to her, and thought, with a strange and rising horror, of every small kindness she had allowed herself to accept from a man she now understood had never once told her the truth. Diana, for her part, swept forward to greet him with every practiced grace her mother had never had the leisure to teach Clara, and the Duke bowed over her hand with perfect chilly correctness, and said nothing at all that suggested he had spent the better part of a month sleeping above her family's stable. He danced the first dance with Diana as duty and Lady Pembridge's careful arrangements required, and all the while his eyes kept finding Clara's across the room, apologetic and pleading in a way no formal beau ever could be, until Clara, unable to bear the weight of it, withdrew to the far side of the room where the older ladies sat with their fans and their gossip, and tried to make herself as small and unremarkable as the evening required of her. Lady Pembridge, watching the whole of this from beside the refreshment table, drew close to her nephew between dances and asked, in the low, knowing voice of a woman who had arranged half the marriages in the county and missed very little in the doing of it, whether he meant to go through with the match as planned, or whether something had changed since last they had spoken of it in London. "Something has changed," Gideon admitted, "though I could not have told you a month ago what precisely it would turn out to be." "I did wonder," said his aunt, when Fenn's boy mentioned to my coachman that a new groom had been taken on at Winslow Hall some weeks past, answering to a name I had never heard you use since your father's funeral, and bearing, by the coachman's account, a most uncommon resemblance to a certain duke of my acquaintance. She said this without the least trace of scandal in her voice, only a dry, fond amusement, and patted his arm once, briskly, the way she had done since he was a boy too proud to admit he wanted comforting. "I shall not pretend to be surprised, Gideon. I have watched you distrust every woman in London for 3 years running, and I confess I had begun to despair of you ever trusting one at all. Whatever you mean to do tonight, do it plainly, and do it kindly, and I will stand behind you, whatever comes of it." He thanked her, and said nothing further, because Diana had chosen that moment to begin her small, deliberate cruelty across the room, and every other consideration fell away before it. It might have gone on that way, the performance completing itself as arranged, the contracts drawn, the whole quiet catastrophe proceeding exactly as Diana intended, had Diana herself not, an hour into the evening, made the single miscalculation that would undo her. She had seen, across the ballroom, the look that had passed between the Duke and her sister, and misunderstanding its true nature entirely, had decided that the surest way to secure her own position was to remove any possible rival from the field before the contracts could be questioned. She did it publicly, and she did it well, in the way of someone who has practiced cruelty long enough to make it sound like concern. She drew a small crowd near the refreshment table, ostensibly to laugh over some trifle, and raised her voice just enough to carry to the Duke, who stood nearby in conversation with Lady Pembridge, and said of Clara that it was really quite sad, wasn't it? How her sister had lately taken to mooning over the new stable hand. A common groom of all people, as though a woman so plainly unwanted by anyone of quality must console herself wherever she could find it. And wasn't it fortunate, she added with a small false laugh, that at least one Winslow daughter knew how to conduct herself properly before a duke. The room went quiet in the particular way that precedes a scandal. Clara, standing very straight with her chin lifted and her eyes bright with the tears she had sworn so many times would never fall in front of anyone, felt the whole weight of every eye in the ballroom and thought, with the strange calm of true humiliation, that she would not give her sister the satisfaction of watching her weep. 1 second. 2. 3. The silence held. It was the Duke who broke it, and he did not do it gently. "I believe," said Gideon, Duke of Marlstone, in a voice that carried to every corner of that suddenly silent room, "that I am the stable hand in question, Miss Winslow, and I will thank you to speak of Miss Clara Winslow with rather more care than you have troubled to show tonight." The room did not merely go quiet. It went to stone. Somewhere near the musicians, a violin bow was set down too abruptly, and the small sound of it seemed, in that silence, almost as loud as a shout. He crossed the floor to where Clara stood, and did not stop until he was near enough that she could see, plainly, that he meant every word he was about to say to the whole assembled company of Somerset's finest families. "I have spent a month in this household under a false name," he said, "to learn what manner of family I was being asked to marry into, before I let anyone arrange my heart for me the way contracts are so often arranged. In that month I have watched Miss Clara Winslow set a stable boy's broken wrist with her own 2 hands, and no thought of thanks. I have watched her save back bread for a kitchen girl too shy to ask for more, and mend an old man's coat because no one else troubled to notice it wanted mending, and rescue a pair of gloves from a fire out of nothing but respect for what other people's labour had made, and nurse a garden back from 4 years of neglect, with nothing but patience, and a willingness to keep returning to it, when any sensible person would have given it up as dead. I have watched her absorb unkindness from her own family, with a grace I have rarely seen matched in any drawing-room in London, and call it nothing at all, because she had long ago stopped expecting to be seen." He paused and looked, deliberately, at Diana. "I have also, in that month, overheard a conversation 3 nights past concerning certain debts against the family's credit, undisclosed to Sir Edmund, and concealed from the very settlements my solicitor is even now drawing up. Debts, Miss Diana, that you assured your cousin I need never learn of before the contracts were signed." Diana's face went the colour of old paper. "That is a lie," she said, too quickly, too loudly, and the room's attention, which had been fixed on Clara a moment before, swung entirely and permanently toward her instead. "It is not a lie," said Gideon, "and I expect your father's solicitor will find it easily enough confirmed, should the matter want confirming, in the accounts of every tradesman in the village who has extended you credit against the promise of a duchess's custom. I say this not to ruin an evening, but because I will not stand in a room and watch a woman of true character be humiliated by a sister who has built her own position on debts and rumour both." Sir Edmund, gone quite grey about the mouth, took a step forward as if to speak, and then, finding no ready words for a truth he had plainly never suspected, said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, an answer. Gideon turned back to Clara, and his voice, when it reached her, had gone entirely gentle, entirely certain. "I did not come to this house to choose the daughter I was sent to choose. I came, and I stayed, because I found the daughter no one thought to arrange for me at all, and I find I want no other. Miss Winslow, Clara, I have very little claim left to make on your good opinion, having deceived you as to my name for the whole of a month, but I will make it plainly, before every witness in this room, because you have spent your whole life being unseen in it, and I will not let one more evening pass where that remains true. I love you. I have loved you since I watched you set a boy's wrist in the mud, and ask nothing for it. I am asking you, in front of everyone who has ever failed to notice what you are worth, to be my wife. The tears Clara had sworn so many times would never fall in front of anyone, fell then, not from grief, not from the humiliation her sister had tried so hard to manufacture, but from something so entirely unfamiliar to her that she had no other name ready for it but joy. And she found, to her own considerable astonishment, that she did not mind in the least that the whole room could see her weeping. "You saw me," she said, "and it was not quite a question." "I was only paying attention," he said. "Anyone might have, if they had troubled to look." She married him 6 weeks later, in the village church her family had attended for 3 generations, in a gown that was, for once, entirely new, sewn by the same dressmaker who had cut Diana's gloves wrong, though this time the seams were faultless. Sir Edmund, chastened by the discovery of debts he had known nothing of, made what peace he could with a daughter he had overlooked for 23 years, and gave her away with a look on his face that Clara suspected, though she never asked, might have been the closest thing to shame he had allowed himself to feel in a very long while. Diana, her prospects considerably diminished by an evening's exposed dishonesty, retreated for a season to a distant aunt's household to wait out the scandal, and returned, in time, a somewhat humbler woman for it. Though that is a story for another evening. Old Fen wept openly at the wedding breakfast, and claimed afterward that he had known all along there was something uncommon about the new groom's hands, too soft for stable work, though no one troubled to point out that he had said nothing of it at the time. Tam, grown bold with the license of the day, informed the assembled company that he had always known Mr. Hart was secretly a duke, on the grounds that dukes were the only sort of person who mended trellises without being paid for it, and the whole party laughed, and Clara laughed hardest of all, because it was, in its own small way, entirely true. It was 6 months later, in the high golden days of early summer, that the walled garden behind what was now Clara's own great house at Marlstone bloomed in full for the first time since her mother had died. She had brought cuttings from the old rosebush with her, tended by her own hands the whole winter through, and they had taken root in the new soil as readily as she herself had taken root in. A life she had once believed was never meant for her. The gardeners at Marlstone, accustomed to grander schemes and finer varieties, had at first regarded the modest cuttings with polite bewilderment, until they saw how the new Duchess tended them herself, sleeves pushed back, knees in the earth, and understood that this small square of red blooms was worth more to the house than every hothouse orchid combined, and left it, thereafter, entirely to her care. Gideon found her there at dusk, as he so often did now, kneeling in the warm earth with her sleeves pushed back and her hair coming loose from its pins, and he knelt beside her the way he had that first evening, and took her hand the way he no longer had to stop himself from doing. "You are smiling," she said, glancing up at him, "which I am told you did not do before." "I am told a great many things about the man I used to be," he said, "most of them true. I find I do not miss him." She laughed, low and unguarded, and turned her face up into the last of the light, and somewhere behind them, through the open window of the house, a small sound could be heard that neither of them remarked upon just then, though it would, before the year was out, become the whole centre of their days, the sound of a nursery being readied, of a house that had learned, at last, how to expect good news, and to keep expecting it. She had written to Tam only that week, offering him a place in the Marlstone stables once he was of an age for it, and had received back a letter, badly spelled and entirely sincere, thanking her for remembering a boy that most great houses would already have forgotten. Sir Edmund had written twice since the wedding, careful, halting letters that read like a man practising an apology he did not yet know how to finish, and Clara had answered both with a warmth she did not entirely feel, but meant, in time, to grow into honestly, because she had decided, somewhere in the quiet months of her new life, that she would rather be the kind of woman who offered forgiveness before it was fully earned than the kind who waited, as she once had, for a recognition that might never come at all. Diana had not written at all, and Clara found, to her own mild surprise, that this troubled her rather less than she had expected it to, as though the whole shape of that old ache had finally been permitted to close over, the way a wound closes once it is no longer picked at daily. "Do you ever think," she asked him, as the light went from gold to grey, "of how near we came to never saying any of it at all?" "Every day," he said, "which is why I mean to keep saying it, until neither of us can quite remember a time we didn't. And in the walled garden at Marlstone, in the last warm hour before the candles were lit, the rose that had once fought so hard merely to survive stood in full and easy bloom, needing, now, only what it had always needed, someone willing to keep coming back to it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.